Hey everyone, Raptorspank here, and today we have Metacheck November 17th. This is a show where I look at the meta and talk about a couple of decks I find interesting that are trending. So let's talk about where we are post 1.14. Aggro is still basically the big dog in the meta, if we want to call it that. Bilgewater Burn and particularly Discard Aggro are very, very populous. You'll run into them a lot. They're still doing exceptionally well. Obviously, Discard Aggro is better, and Bilgewater really hasn't been touched. There's a couple of changes, but we'll talk about that. With Bilgewater Burn has made a few changes since the last time I showed it on this show, so I'll talk about that one later. Um, Bilgewater Spring is still very good. A little worse, I would say, with the rise in Piltover. While it does have a lot of ways to deal with Piltover removal, its units often end up in a place where Piltover removal is very effective against them, so it can be very hard for them to deal with all of it. That said, it's still in a very solid spot. It's definitely still a good deck, and a great deck to consider if you're looking to climb. It's one of the better combo decks out there right now. There's a bunch of spicier decks that have popped up, I've noticed, particularly at the beginning of this week, so I'll talk about two of those later. Particularly, Go Hard has changed quite a bit, so I think Spooky Karma might actually... I think there's decks that do what that deck does, they just do it better and more consistently, but we'll talk about that later on in the video. So I do still think that deck is decent, but I think there are better options if you want to go that route. I mentioned in my last On the Grind that I would talk a little bit more about the deck now, and I haven't gotten in as many games as I wanted, but Noxus Piltover Ezreal is still really, really good. I noticed that on some of the other tier lists that they're running Draven instead of Swain. I think Swain is still the better option because I think Swain is a very reliable win condition, and I think right now Ezreal's just not a great win condition on his own. He's a great card, and a great deck, and I think he's really, really good in, say, the Ezreal Swain deck. I think that deck is very solid, and I think he's a great inclusion in it. But as a win condition himself, he leaves a lot to be desired, essentially, because his nerf is pretty huge to the leveled up version, but it is extra damage that's good, and what's really, really good about him is generating the Mystic Shots. That's one thing I like about what they've done with Ezreal, is that he's much more about not just throwing him down and then casting a bunch of spells. Like, what Ezreal does is actually really important to the deck now, and you can actually go a little more controlling with your spells because that's going to do a lot of damage still. So he's a little more versatile, but a little, not versatile, but he's a little more tuned to dealing with your opponent's stuff and a little less tuned to the combo win. So it's a lot more relevant that he can actually hit and get Mystic Shots to actually close out the game, but he's very solid, very good, and Ezreal decks are doing very well right now. I think Swain is just the better version of the deck because of the fact that Swain is a very legitimate win condition on his own, and it does enable you to use something like Leviathan, which is a great win condition as well, let alone the fact that the combination of the two of them is one of the more powerful combos in the game, and that's still true now as it was, months ago. Now, where am I at with the deck? I have played not as many ranked games as I had wanted to get in by the time this video went up, but I have played 5 more games, and currently with the deck I am 9-4. So what I said during On the Grind was I believe that the win rate would go up with a little more practice or a little more warm-ups with the deck, and that has proven to be true. It's done very well against Draven Jinx, so at the time of filming, I had lost 1 game to it, and while that's not in the video, it was a very close game, and I lost 1 health to, or I was at 1 health, and they managed to top deck, get excited, I think. Oh no, I was at 3. They were at 1, I think. 2 is what it was. I've played the deck twice since then. I've won both times, and in fact, I would go as far as to say that it hasn't been particularly close, or I mean, it's a certain degree of close because it'll always be against that deck, but it's been a pretty convincing win where I wasn't really feeling that pressured, which for a deck that has no life gain, I think that's pretty important to note. I've lost to Bilgewater Spring. Like I said, I think we're really, really good, but they had double Star Spring, they had Boxtopus, they had all 3 of their guiding touches. They had all 3 Boxtopuses, all 3 guiding touches, double Pale Cascade to keep Soraka alive through a Culling Strike. and the double Star Spring, so they comboed off very, very quickly, and they still barely won. I almost had them dead, and if I had one more turn, I would have won. So I think that matchup is super favored. I think they have to really have that kind of insane nuts draw to have any chance. So I think that's a good matchup. I think I just got a little bit unlucky. I played against Deep Monsters. That was weird, but in the end we won, and it wasn't really that close. It's just that their late game is that scary, so I felt scared the whole time. But it did have a incredible blowout final turn to the game in which my opponent had a Nautilus. He had swung, I blocked with Sentry. It dropped it to a 13-11, and he had 4 mana left because he had played Nautilus and then swung with it, and so he still had 4 mana left on turn 8. He cast Riptide, targeting my Leviathan. I had Leviathan Swain out. I cast Scorched Earth to kill his Nautilus, which meant that he didn't shuffle my unit, he didn't have a Nautilus on a board, and the Riptide was a Nautilus Riptide, so he even lost 2 Nautiluses, essentially, for the price of 1. That was probably the most depressing thing I've ever seen in this game, is what happened to our opponent in that game. But I think that matchup could be pretty reasonable for us. It definitely didn't feel doomed. It felt fairly reasonable, and our aggro strategy can be a bit better against them, or we can get a lot of damage in early. They don't necessarily have a lot of ways to deal with Ezreal, as long as we keep up some way to deal with something like the Jaw Hunters. So that seems pretty solid. So that's my little in-depth rant on where that deck's at now that I've played a bit more of it. So I think that's in a great spot. I think it's a very exceptional deck to run with. I messed around with Ionia, Piltover Ezreal, and Frozen Ezreal, both of which don't feel particularly great. So I am not 100% ready to give up on them, but definitely the Noxus variant seems to be a little bit better at the moment. So that's what I would consider if you want to go the Ezreal route. But yeah, other than that, I think we should talk about some decks. Rush Ramp has kind of I've noticed a new version of it, but we'll talk about that in the decks. But let's start with something a little more routine. Let's start with Bilgewater Burn and talk about how the deck looks now. So, Bilgewater Burn is one of the traditional aggro/burn decks. It's still very strong, and it competes with Discard Aggro to be the best aggro deck of the format. I think after the Jinx buffs, that Discard Aggro might have the slight edge. It's pretty hard to say, though. But let's talk about the updates. First off, we're back/still with the 4 1-drops, depending on where you personally were at last time you played this deck. I think I might have been at the 4 1-drops again, but the deck has switched on and off with that. It dropped Precious Pet for a while. It ran Precious Pet, Saboteur, Butcher, and no Corsair, and then it picked up Corsair, dropped Precious Pet to deal with all the Freljord Shadow Isles decks that were running like Withering Wail and Vile Feast, just to have more 2-health things, and then now it's back up to 4 1-drops. I think last time I may have covered this deck, it might have been 4 1-drops, but hard to say. Right now, it's definitely in a good spot for the 4 1-drops to just be as aggressive as possible. And then another big change here is that obviously we dropped Make It Rain because of the nerfs to that card, makes it not so viable in this deck. But we're actually running an extra Captain Farron, which is pretty interesting since I know on a handful of times I've talked about dropping Captain Farron. But he's actually in a really, really great spot right now because he's great against mid-range/control matchups. He's really strong into slow decks, and he's pretty decent into decks like Ezreal too, because even the Noxus Ezreal deck that I talked about earlier has to deal damage to Farron and then do it like a Scorched Earth to get rid of him, or spend all of their mana on a Thermogenic, which isn't necessarily bad for them if they need to level up their Swain. But generally speaking, that'll cost them their entire turn, so he's pretty decent into them, and then really good against control, where it doesn't even matter if he lives or not, because he just gives you the 3 decimates. And they probably won't be able to kill you before your decimates kill them. So he's good into a lot of current matchups, so this is definitely the right time to be running Farron, and to in fact be running an extra copy of it. But basically, deck plays the same way. You want to look for 1 to 3 1-drops in every opener if you can. Against control decks like FS Rush or Go Hard decks, you want to look for 2 health units like Corsair and Grenadier, things that survive stuff like Go Hard or Vile Feast. Butcher's great in this spot too. So that's what you really want to look for into those matchups. And then you almost never want to keep more than 1 3-drop or higher in your hand. These are some of your best top decks you can draw. Like, Decimates are really great to draw. Captain Farron's really great to draw. Like, these are all good cards to peel off the top of your deck, so don't feel you have to keep them, even if it's a good matchup for it. You almost never want to keep Fervor in your opening hand. It's good against Fiora decks, but that's about it. Otherwise, you'd rather just go for more reliable aggro or more creatures to go wide and just have Fervor be a top deck / something that Zap Sprayfin can find for you. So just keep that in mind. Jack or Farron is very strong for mid-range / control, as I mentioned. Jack is really good in those matchups as well because it's very easy for those matchups to gum up the board or slow us down, and Jack's guaranteed burn damage to the Nexus is very, very strong. It's a little bit weaker into hard control because it helps kill our units for our opponent, but generally speaking, it's really good for getting a lot of damage every turn into our opponent, and that's really, really good through blockers. So definitely a strong card into those matchups. And now let's talk about a little bit of a more interesting spicy deck / new brew, essentially, which is the Bilgewater Shadow Isles Go Hard Midrange deck. This is Go Hard combined with loads of card draw from Bilgewater to keep the engine running. Go Hard is the spell that when you cast, it creates copies in your deck, and once you've cast it 3 times, it turns all those copies into Pack Your Bags, which deals a ton of damage, 5 to be precise, or we have ways in this deck to do even more damage, but deals that damage to the opponent's Nexus and all of their units, so it's a great board wipe card. But basically what this has over something like Spooky Karma is it has a lot more card draw because of Bilgewater, so we can cycle through them quicker and get to the Pack Your Bags a lot faster than other decks might be able to do. And because of this, we have a natural other win condition to pair with this, which is Twisted Fate. He's a great draw-based win condition, and he's just a strong control piece. So this works really well with what the rest of the deck is trying to do. Then we have cards like Elise, Jagged Butcher, Doombeast, and the one of Gangplank to basically serve as a strong potential aggro package if we need to flip the script and go aggressive. So we have that as well. Crumble gives us an answer to landmark threats like Bilgewater Spring. I'm still not 100% sold on this card because it's so easy to basically mess this card up because your unit has to live and Crumble has to not be countered for it to go off. But if we're really worried about Bilgewater Spring, that deck has very few answers to Crumble, so it should be able to go off, and it should deal with their Star Spring, and that should be enough to win us the game. So for those matchups, it's really good to have Crumble, but I'm not entirely sold on the 2 of, but that's the list that I found and the list I've been messing around with, so that's an option. Against aggro, you want to look for low curve, stuff like Go Hard, Butcher, and then if it's especially discard aggro, but even regular aggro, this is good, but Twisted Fate's really great in that matchup. If you were on the attack turn 4, it's phenomenal into discard aggro because you can play him and deal 1 to all units, which should wipe their board. And then their crowd favorite, if they do have it, is useless that turn now. So he's really, really good in that matchup because it does usually serve as a board wipe and kill all of their stuff or everything that's relevant. So he's great into that matchup. Against midrange, you want to look for card draw and then hard removal spells, stuff like Vengeance and Ruination. Ruination is great against midrange decks like Bannerman, as always. That's always been a deck where Ruination is strong, so it's still good there. Vengeance is great against Swain decks because you really usually just have to answer 1 to 2 threats, so it's great against killing either Leviathan or Swain, depending on what you need, so it's great into those matchups. And then controls where you want to go a bit aggressive, I think. I'm still not 100% sold on how this matchup plays out, but generally speaking, with stuff like Elise, Jagged Butcher, Gangplank, and some of the other low costs like Doombeast and all that, we should be able to deal a fair amount of damage fairly quick. So that's kind of how I think the best way to play into control would be with this deck. But just generally speaking, this is a solid deck that can do a little bit of everything. It's a true mid-range deck. It can be the control deck in the right matchup. It can be the aggro deck into the right matchup. So it's a really fun deck if you want to feel like you have a decent chance against most decks you run into. And if you just want to play with Go Hard and play it in a deck that's really going to make it matter because you're going to find it. There's so much card draw, you're going to find copies at some point. It's literally almost guaranteed. Now let's talk about a spicy new take on Field Rush that I've noticed. I guess people are calling this K-pop Yetis because of the the KDA part of Field Rush. This basically cuts some of the ramp, particularly Weirding Stones, to make room for powerhouses like Avaros and Trapper. It also cuts some of its control pieces like Withering Whale for this more aggressive early game. It still packs Field Rush as a crazy late game payoff, but it basically goes a little more mid-rangey because of the Trappers, Sentries, and even like Wildclaw and Ancient Yeti can come down fairly quick. So it's a little more of a mid-range take on what used to be a control deck. You want to look for low cost versus aggro. Things like Sentry, Vile Feast, Avalanche, or even Avaros and Trapper can be pretty strong into those matchups. So that's what you want to look for that. You want to look for large units and Vengeance or Ruination against mid-range. As I mentioned, Vengeance, Ruination, really good in mid-range, just like in the last deck. But just in general, we have the option of big things like Alpha Wildclaw, Ancient Yeti, or just Avaros and Trapper that can trade or eat most mid-range threats. So that's another option for those matchups. Controls where you want to kind of go wide and aggressive because we can do that with all the Sentries, Trappers, and like I mentioned, the Wild Claws and Yetis, and basically try to run our opponent out of removal spells in time to land something big like Tryndamere where they have to double up removal, or a Field of Rush that they can't deal with, and then we just finish the game off that way. So that's how you want to play the control matchup, more or less. Honestly, this is a very interesting take on Field Rush, but I am extraordinarily unconvinced. It feels very flimsy, like it's trying to do too many things. Like it dropped its overall win rate to boost its bad matchups. I've messed around with it with a couple of games, not enough to really give a conclusive statement on where it plays in the meta, but it definitely feels like you're probably better off with just the straight control path, but it's just a really interesting deck, which is why I wanted to include it for this video, because I was very surprised when I saw this. I highly disagree with some tier lists putting it as high as A tier, but it's definitely a pretty neat build of the deck that lets you play with a lot of really powerful Freljord cards. Trapper is such a good card, so being able to use that in a Field of Rush shell feels really, really good, and this is definitely one of the Field of Rush decks where you can really feel the difference from, say, a War Mother's deck, because we can get away with all these crazy things. I'm not really convinced on stuff like Ancient Yeti, but I can see why they're dropping the Weirding Stones now that it's so easy to kill it, but now it's missing so much ramp that it feels bad, but Piltover is very good for dealing with the ramp deck that used to exist, since the 2-drop Beholder dies to Mystic Shot and Weirding Stones dies to Get Excited now. So this is an interesting take on it, but I am pretty unconvinced. Thanks for watching the video. The deck codes for all 3 of these decks are available in the description below if you want to try them out. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe for more videos just like it.